All right. So hello, everyone. Thanks for coming along to this talk. I'm just going to share my screen again. So I hope you can see my screen. If not, feel free, or if you stop hearing me at some point, feel free to write something in the chat about that.
有啊，想说我们这边怎么热热的
I think someone's mic is still on. No problem. All right, so reproductive ethics. That's of course a vast topic within applied ethics, and we only have or I only have 30 minutes to talk, so I'm going to narrow that down a little bit. And I was planning to talk about what's often referred to as selection, genetic selection. And I chose that because it raises really interesting puzzles. And the plan is to think through some real and some hypothetical scenarios, and then discuss the implications of accepting a particular view in a more straightforward scenario, the implications of that for our views on more controversial scenarios. So let's start with one scenario to think about. So imagine there's this woman and she has a rubella infection, and she can choose if she conceives now and has becomes pregnant, there is a higher risk that her baby will have a serious intellectual disability because of that infection. But if she waits 3 months to conceive, then actually the baby will have a low risk of a serious intellectual disability because the woman will no longer have the rubella infection. So many people think, if we then ask, like, should the woman wait 3 months to become pregnant? Well, actually, maybe we can do a little poll. I'm just seeing, yeah. Maybe if you think that a woman should wait 3 months to conceive, you could just do like a hands up, like if you have a question. Find the hand. So yeah, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. So a very tiny minority, a majority who thinks that the woman should wait 3 months to conceive. Now, actually, that's, if we like ask people, it's what most people think, and it's also consistent with what health authorities in the UK think. So, so if you think of the congenital Zika syndrome, sorry. So the Zika, someone else raised their hand, I think. So the Zika virus is not dangerous for the person who's infected, but of course, if a woman becomes pregnant when infected, there's an increased chance or an increased risk that the child will have congenital Zika syndrome. And children with that syndrome have microcephaly, so they have a smaller head than expected, and that's associated with reduced brain development and other developmental problems. So the health advice of Public Health England, the health advice for women returning from a country or an area with a risk for Zika virus transmission is that they avoid becoming pregnant for 2 months or 3 months in some cases. So it's exactly sort of the same sort of scenario where we have this woman who recently traveled to a country with Zika. If she conceives now, there's a significant risk of microcephaly for her child. If she waits 3 months until we're sort of more confident that she's no longer infected, then there's a low risk that her child will have microcephaly. So Public Health England thinks that the woman should wait to conceive. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the implications of this view in a maybe, for some people at least, fairly straightforward case on our views about genetic selection. So what is genetic selection? It involves choosing to bring one child into existence rather than another. And that choice is partly based on genetic characteristics of the possible children we can create. So the claim I'm going to try to defend is that if the woman in the rubella or in the Zika case has a strong moral reason to defer conception until she no longer has infection, then prospective parents also have a strong moral reason to pursue more contentious forms of genetic selection. So it'll be interesting to see what you think about this and whether you think that indeed, there is this implication where if we think that the woman should defer conception in the rubella and the Zika cases, that implies that we have to sort of accept more controversial types of genetic selection. Okay, so to think about that, we of course need to provide a reason for why we think that the woman in the Zika case, or the woman in the rubella case, or the couple, of course, has to, or we think has a strong reason to defer conception. And something that has often been adduced, a reason that has often been adduced is that, well, if she conceives now, if she doesn't wait, that would actually harm the future child. But I think that's not really right. That can't really be the reason, because usually we think that something harms a person if it makes that person worse off than she would otherwise have been. But conceiving now rather than later would not make the resulting child worse off than she would otherwise have been, because that child would otherwise not have existed. That's why it's a case of selection. So had the woman deferred conception, a different sperm would have fertilized a different egg and a different child would have come into existence. Okay? So it's about a choice between child A and child B. And it's not about whether child A could exist with, severe cognitive disability or without a severe cognitive disability. It's about a choice between different children, different sorts of children. So the woman, it seems, has a reason to bring one type of child into existence rather than another. So what sort of reason would she have to do, like what sort of child should she choose? So we could say something like, if she's going to bring a child into existence, well, maybe she has a reason to ensure that the child will not be disposed to disease or disability. Because, the outcome, the state of affairs will be better if she creates a child that is not disposed to disease or disability. And that's the sort of reason that obviously is relevant in the rubella and the Zika cases. And it also seems relevant in many other reproductive decisions, because there are many ways in which prospective parents can influence whether the child they will create will be predisposed to disease or disability. So just think of the decision to have a child when one is younger versus when one is a bit older. So if you choose to have a child when you're younger, then you choose a child with a low risk of having Down syndrome. Whereas if you wait to have a child until you're in your 40s, then your child has a higher risk of developing Down syndrome. So we could say there is some reason, some moral reason to have a child when you're younger. Of course, this is not an absolute reason, and there might be other strong reasons to wait to have a child. So say career reasons or relationship reasons or financial reasons. But nevertheless, all things being equal, we think that there is a good reason maybe to have or to choose a child that it will have a lower risk of Down syndrome. So note again that this is a case of selection. It's a case of genetic selection in the case of Down syndrome, where your choice is partly based on genetic information about sort of the possible children you could have. And of course, prospective parents can make use of various technologies to influence whether they have a child genetically disposed to disease or disability. So pregnant women generally undergo at least some prenatal screening or testing, for example, to detect chromosomal abnormalities, such as Downs or Patau's or Edwards syndrome. And if the test results are positive, the individual or the couple could opt for a termination of pregnancy, at least in most countries. And they could try to conceive again. And that's a form of genetic selection, to choose one child over another. Another technology that has been widely used is preimplantation genetic diagnosis. So that's part of as part of an IVF treatment, in vitro fertilization. So that's usually used when there is reason to suspect that an individual or a couple may pass on an inheritable genetic disease, such as cystic fibrosis or Huntington's. So in IVF, the egg and the sperm are, the egg is fertilized with the sperm in the laboratory. It's in a dish in the lab. Several embryos are created, and these can be tested genetically. And then usually the unaffected embryos are used for implantation into the uterus of the woman to create a pregnancy. And in the UK, PGD is widely used for around 600 different disorders now, most of them single gene disorders, but also for carrier status, so where you're not ill yourself, but you can pass on the disease to your child, or when you're predisposed to a serious disease, or for certain disabilities. Now, so if we return to the rubella and the zika cases, it might seem that if we think that the woman has a reason to defer conception in order to have a child not disposed to disease or disability, then likewise, prospective parents have a reason to use techniques like prenatal diagnosis and preimplantation genetic diagnosis to reduce their chance of having a child disposed to disease or disability. In all these cases, the structure of the choice is the same. They have to choose which of the possible children they could bring into existence. They can be informed by genetic characteristics of these possible children, and they choose children that are not disposed to disability or disease. And in the UK and most other countries, these technologies are used to select non-affected embryos, so embryos without a disease or disability. But what many people hadn't anticipated when lauding these technologies is that they can, of course, also be used to select for a disability or a disease. And a high-profile case is that of Tomato Lici and Paula Garfield. So in 2008, this couple, they're a deaf couple in the UK, they publicly announced that they would like to use PGD, so preimplantation genetic diagnosis, to select a deaf child. So they wanted to be able, they said, to have a child that is similar to themselves, and they don't see deafness as a disability. So they say it's just a difference. And they argue that not allowing the use of PGD to select for a deaf child actually amounts to discrimination against deaf people. And making PGD compulsory to select a hearing embryo, they said, is a form of eugenics. Now, there were many negative reactions to the couple's wish to select a deaf child. And as a result, in 2008, the law regulating assisted reproduction in England and Wales was amended to include a clause prohibiting the use of these technologies to choose children with a disability. And here, deafness is not mentioned, but in an explanatory clause, deafness is explicitly mentioned. So it's not, people in England and Wales are not allowed to select for a deaf child. In the US, for example, or some other countries, situation is a bit different. So in the US, the private sector is largely unregulated, and there are a small number of clinics offering PGD to select for deafness and some other, what some people call disabilities. But of course, even if the law is restrictive, one doesn't necessarily need these technologies to select a deaf child. So there's this other case, an earlier case in the 90s of a deaf lesbian couple, and they deliberately tried to create a deaf child with the help of a sperm donor. So they asked a deaf friend from a family with 5 generations of deafness to donate sperm, so they would have a child with a high chance of being deaf. And again, they said deafness is not a disability, it's a cultural identity. We are a minority group. We see it as paralleling being Jewish or being Black, they said. Now, one may agree or disagree with these parents, but these sort of cases do challenge the reason I gave for deferring conception in the rubella and the Zika cases, and also the reasons for using genetic selection technologies, and I'll explain why. So we said in the first cases, why should a woman defer conception? So one sort of plausible option was that she has reason to ensure that a child that she will create will not be disposed to disease or disability. But let's assume it's true that people with deafness have, on average, very good lives, which is very plausible, of course. Why indeed should we select against deafness? And that raises a very important question. Is health what ultimately matters? So we can question this because in life, we often sacrifice health to achieve other things that we value and that increase our well-being. So think of the mountaineer who takes risks and who put their health at risk to achieve things that make them happy, or to sort of realize important goals in their lives, things that increase their well-being. So maybe as long as a disability or a disease doesn't make one's life go worse than it would otherwise go, it doesn't seem all that problematic. So in other words, perhaps there's nothing wrong with disease or disability in itself, but it's only problematic if it significantly reduces a person's well-being, if it tends to result in a person's life going less well than it would otherwise go. So for example, if it results in pain, or if it significantly reduces one's lifespan. Now, this suggests that the reason at play in the rubella and in the Zika case is not ultimately a reason to avoid having children predisposed to a disease or a disability, I think. Rather, it's a reason to have children who will have good lives with much well-being. And it just happens that in some cases, maybe in many cases, disability and disease tend to limit well-being. So ultimately, it is well-being that matters. That's the thought here. And diseases and disabilities matter only insofar as they detract from well-being. But then, of course, even if we agree with that, and you may already disagree here, of course, but even if you agree that it is indeed well-being that ultimately matters, then, of course, there's a further question. How much well-being should we strive for in our children? So some believe that we should just aim for a level of well-being above a minimal threshold. So perhaps we just have to ensure that the child that we're going to create won't suffer from pain or discomfort, or won't have a significantly reduced life expectancy. So if you have two embryos, say, you can choose from, and both of these embryos can be expected to result in a child that will have a good level of well-being, a level of well-being above that minimal threshold. It doesn't matter which one you choose. Then others think we should strive for a good enough level of well-being, a sufficient level of well-being. So probably there the threshold is a bit higher. And then there are others who think this is implausible. And indeed, there is something problematic about aiming for good enough. So just think about this scenario. Suppose you have a child, she has to go to a new school, she's 12, say, and there are two schools in your neighborhood, and they're good schools, and in many aspects they're quite similar, but one of the schools will likely be a much better fit for your child's personality and the way she learns things. So you have some reason to think that though your child would be happy in either school, she's likely to be somewhat better off in one of the schools, say the orange and purple one. So should we then not choose for that school the best one? Now, so if we think we should, it seems that it follows from that if we have two embryos and all else is equal, shouldn't we also choose for the embryo with the highest expected well-being? And that's at least what Professor Julian Savulescu and Guy Kahane, both from the Oxford Uehiro Center, have argued. And they've defended a principle that sort of advises people to do just that, to try to select the child from the possible children you can have, whose life can be expected to go best, or at least not worse than any of the others. And they call that principle procreative beneficence. And with best life, they mean the life containing most well-being. So this is a very controversial principle, and it has been widely debated in the bioethics literature and so on. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that they're saying that couples have a significant moral reason to select that sort of child. And it's sort of important to pause here a little bit, because they're not saying that you have an absolute obligation to select the child that you think will, whose life can be expected to go best. But it's just a strong reason, and there might be other reasons to, choose a different child, but still there is a strong reason. Now, of course, people may disagree at this point, but if you accept that view, it does maybe have a counterintuitive implication, or an implication that many people would resist. Because, if it's well-being that ultimately matters, and we want to sort of choose a child, whose life we think will contain most well-being compared to other possible children, we should care about everything that affects well-being when selecting a child. Of course, disease and disability are not the only things that reduce well-being, and they don't necessarily reduce well-being, but there are also psychological traits like personality traits that tend to reduce a person's well-being. So, for example, think of poor impulse control. So if you have poor impulse control, that significantly increases your chances of ending up in prison. And often these personality traits have, some genetic component. I'll say a bit more about it later. So if we think about a hypothetical case, and I stress this is a hypothetical case, this is purely just imaginative, but just to sort of test your own intuitions. Say there's this woman again, she has a rubella infection, and if she conceives now, there's a high risk that her baby will have low impulse control. But if she waits 3 months, there's a low risk that her child will have low impulse control. So what should the woman do? It seems that if we think that in the Zika case and in the original rubella case, if we think that a woman should defer conception, and if we think that well-being is what matters ultimately, it seems that we also have to commit ourselves to the view that in this sort of case, the woman should also wait 3 months to conceive. Of course, I mentioned it's a hypothetical case. It's not possible to test for this. Many of our personality traits are determined by genes and the environment. There's a genetic component, but there's usually not just one gene that sort of causes a certain personality trait. It's usually spread over hundreds or even thousands of DNA regions. But on the other hand, behavioral genetics, they're making process, and they might find some traits with a genetic component we can test for, or we will be able to test for at some point, because now we have sequencing technologies, we have the development of vast genetic databases, and we're already capable of calculating what's called polygenetic risk scores, which give a person's likelihood of getting a particular disease or having a certain trait that is caused by multiple genes. So it is possible that we'll be able to test for maybe some important traits in the future. And indeed, in the US, there's this company called Genome Predictions, and they claim that it will be possible within 10 years to rank embryos by this in vitro created embryos by potential IQ. It's not clear whether that will be possible. It's quite an ambitious claim. But the company already offers sort of tests aimed at screening out embryos with abnormally low IQ to couples being treated at fertility treatment, so an IQ of 70 or below. In any case, so just to sort of think again about the implications of some people's view in the rubella case, the initial case with which we started, in the Zika case, you know, if we think that the woman in the rubella case has this reason to defer conception until the infection is over, then it seems that prospective parents have a significant moral reason, you know, to employ genetic selection in order to avoid having children with some disease or disability where this can be expected to limit their well-being, and maybe also other characteristics that intend to limit the well-being of the child. And that's, of course, a very troubling thing for many people. And then just before I finish, there's something else I think it's still important to think about. So, of course, decisions about what type of child to have will affect the well-being of other people, parents, siblings, grandchildren, strangers, and so on. Say having a child with an expensive to treat genetic disease that will have an impact on society, or a child with risk factors for criminality that can impose significant costs on others. And it seems a bit arbitrary to consider only the well-being of the future child when we're thinking about what sort of children to bring into the world. So Professor Savulescu and Kahane's principle, procreative beneficence, only thinks about the well-being of the child that will be created. So if prospective parents have reasons to have children with good lives, then might not they also have reasons to have children whose existence will contribute more to the well-being of others. So suppose, again, a purely hypothetical case, this woman has a rubella infection, she has her choice, she can either conceive now, but then her baby will be at higher risk of emotional callousness, so it will be insensitive and a cruel disregard for others. Or she can wait 3 months till the infection is over, and then her child will be at a low risk of emotional callousness. Should a woman wait 3 months to conceive? I think she has a strong reason to wait, if that were possible. A more realistic case is that where prospective parents could choose between two possible children, and one child will have blood group AB, which means that the child will be a universal recipient, or they can choose a child with a blood group O, so which means that the child will be a universal donor, so it can receive blood from, it can donate blood to everyone. Procreative beneficence would say, well, the parents should choose the child with blood group AB, but I think there's at least some reason, you know, to choose the other child that will also contribute to the well-being of others. And I mean, it's not so important, but like together with Professor Tom Douglas, I developed this principle called procreative altruism. And we just think that when we're thinking about selection, like what child to choose, we should also think about the effects our choice will have on other people. So we think that couples or single producers also have a strong moral reason to select the child of the possible children they could have, whose existence will contribute most or detract least from the well-being of others. Now, so to summarize, we started from the rubella case, where most people thought like that the woman should defer conception until the infection was over in order to have a child with a low risk of having a severe cognitive disability. And I've argued that prospective parents actually also have, if we accept that view, then we should also accept that prospective parents have a moral reason to pursue genetic selection to avoid having a child with a disposition to some disease or disability that reduces well-being, or a disposition to some other traits that are not related to diseases that we think will reduce well-being. And dispositions that tend to reduce well-being of others, something to take into account as well. So these are very radical implications of accepting a certain view in a more straightforward case, and many would find them unacceptable. They're definitely out of line with the laws and regulations regarding genetic selection in most countries. So definitely in the UK, where PGD is only allowed in these restrictive cases to avoid disease and disability and so on. Of course, regulations may simply reflect the current state of science. Currently, there's no way to select against most non-disease related traits, like poor impulse control or emotional callousness. But I think it also reflects a widely held moral view that selection, insofar as it's acceptable, it's only acceptable to select against serious disability or disease. So what I try to do is something typical that ethicists do, of course, is to challenge this view. And of course, one could say, well, either you change, if you don't want to accept these implications, you can change your view about the rubella or the zika case, or you can just bite the bullet and sort of accept, right? If I accept this view in the zika and rubella case, it does indeed imply that I have to sort of accept this more controversial view. Or a third option is, of course, to show why these cases differ in morally relevant ways, so that they're not analogous and that you have a good reason to accept one view in the least controversial case and a very different view when it comes to genetic selection for, say, non-disease related traits. Anyway, I'm going to stop here and I hope there'll be some questions from you. Feel free to either ask in the chat or just via the microphone. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen.